So our first talk today is on gluten-related disorders. Anybody in the room not eat gluten or try to avoid it? Okay. So like I eat gluten. I don't feel any different, but I try to avoid it anyway. Okay? Every once in a while I kind of slip. So we're going to talk about gluten-related disorders. And when Pat asked me to do this, I said, Pat, this is the Diabetes Research and Education and Action Foundation. This isn't just about gluten. Let's tie this back to type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So that's what I'm going to do, and then give you some takeaways. So that's the first talk, and then we'll take a break. And then the second talk, I'm going to speak about Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, because this is something that's important for everybody in the room. I'm staying with a friend right now. Her mother has Alzheimer's. My mother-in-law had Alzheimer's. My mother had strokes that burned away her brain eventually. So this is something that we really want to prevent. And so we'll talk mostly about how we prevent Alzheimer's, because once you got it, I'm sorry, it's really hard. There are some things you can do, but it's not a panacea for everybody. So here we go. So gluten-related disorders. So up until about 5 years ago, we had one gluten-related, maybe 10 years ago, we had one gluten-related disorder, and that was celiac disease. So I'm going to talk about that pretty extensively. And then Dr. Alessio Fasano, one of his patients, he said to her, I'm happy to tell you, you do not have celiac disease, so you do not have to avoid eating gluten. And she came back to him about 3 months later, and she said, thank you, I feel so much better. And he said, what did you do? She goes, I stopped eating gluten. He said, but you don't have celiac disease. And she's like, yeah, but I feel great. And so he and other researchers started thinking about, well, is there something else going on? And now we have non-celiac gluten sensitivity or gluten sensitivity. And then we have people who actually, not very many, have wheat allergies. And then we have a few people who have sensitivities to some of the other proteins in wheat, like lectins. And they find that they can't, wheat germ agglutinin, and they can't tolerate wheat for that reason. So the research keeps just fractionating and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then some people, when they eat gluten, and I'll talk about this, it's like you just put them, like they just smoked opium. They go into a fog. Okay, so we'll talk about all of these different things and split all of these. So what's the big deal? Okay, so about 1% of the population has celiac disease. And celiac disease is a genetic, lifelong, you got it, you should never, ever, 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 ever eat gluten, period. Okay? I worked with somebody a few years ago, and she had a diagnosis of lupus, and then she started getting a skin rash called dermatitis herpetiformis, big words, and went to a dermatologist, and he did a scraping. He said, you have celiac disease. So now she has celiac disease, plus she's got this skin condition, which is a result of the celiac disease, plus she's got lupus, and she keeps eating gluten, and the next thing we know, she's diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Okay, so the problem is that the main reason, if you have one autoimmune disease, you're more likely than an average person to get another autoimmune disease. And so since gluten is the root cause of celiac disease, you got to stop eating it. It's not like a joke, So if you know somebody who's been diagnosed with celiac and they're taking it lightly, ask them not to, okay? I'm not usually so serious, but it's really important. The main thing is that it's doubling the incidence of celiac disease. If you look at these charts, and I'll show you one, they're just going up. They're just going up. And partly that's doctors are getting better at recognizing it, but partly it's just more people have celiac disease. And then non-celiac gluten sensitivity, you know, I've seen different studies. It hovers around 6% of the population. And some people say it could be as high as 10 to 20%, because there's a lot of people who just feel better not eating gluten. And then there's wheat allergy, which is a true allergy where people might get hives or welts, or their lips or tongue might swell up after eating it. It's a real allergy, and it's pretty rare. You see it a lot in kids. I remember when my first son was a baby, he had, somebody gave him like some mixed grain cereal, and in like 5 minutes his mouth was blowing up. So I just never gave him, he was only like 9 months old. I'm like, why are you giving this to him? Anyway, but you know, I just held off on giving him any gluten until he was about 2, and he was fine with it. So, so most kids outgrow it, but so it's pretty rare. So why do we see more? Well, we have much better diagnosis, and we just have also more people who have problems with gluten. So why is this? Okay, and I just found this paper, and I thought it was so fascinating. 20% of all the calories that people eat in the world are wheat. Are wheat. You think about every culture has noodles and bread and crackers and, you know, tortillas made out of wheat, and there's just wheat from everybody. It accounts for more protein than any other food we eat, and we don't really think of it as a high protein food, but some of that protein is gluten. The gluten content is the same now in the wheat as before. You know, that was one of the hypotheses is, well, maybe people are having more gluten problems because the bread has more gluten in it, and it doesn't really have more gluten. Although I do have to say, like, if you ever have made really whole grain bread, is it light and fluffy? Like, no. And that's because it doesn't have all that gluten, you know, but white bread doesn't have more than it had before. And it's, you know, grasses over time, they kind of bred with each other. And the, you know, contemporary wheat is a blend of 3 different types. But interestingly enough, the wheat genome is 5 times bigger than the human genome, which doesn't surprise me because only less, and you can listen to my talk from last year, less than 1% of the cells of the genes in your body are human. The rest are microbes. So, you know, so we don't have very many genes. We have about 25,000. Wheat has about 125,000. And we have 2 copies of each gene, but because wheat mixed with 3 different varieties, they have 6 copies of each gene. And then it gets further complicated because we hybridize. And what we know now is that, like, ancient wheat, which was Eichhorn wheat, had 14 chromosomes, and that was about 50,000 years ago. And Emmer wheat, which you can buy these wheats now, had 28 chromosomes, so it just doubled the amount. And in the 1970s, Dr. Berlog won a Nobel Prize for his work on creating what's called globe wheat. And the creation of globe wheat has 42 chromosomes. So it's not even 28 plus 28. It's something really different that we never had before, okay? And he won a Nobel Prize because on the right side, and I know it's fuzzy, we've got kind of those waves of grain, right? And on the left side, we have this new wheat, the globe wheat, that's short and stubby, but you can raise like 3 times as much wheat on an acre of land. And Dr. Berlog is credited at saving 1 billion lives. 1 billion lives because people didn't starve. And this is the main wheat that's being grown right now all over the world. And I just look at it and I go, yeah, but this is a new to nature food. This isn't a food that has always been around. This is something that we've never seen since, 40 years ago was the first time we saw it. And now we're having more and more problems with wheat. Could this be a reason? And we have lots of hypotheses about this. We have statement papers that say, no, it's not. We have statement papers that say, yes, it might be. We don't really know, but I can tell you that the number of chromosomes in it are dramatically different. That's all I know, and we don't really know. So what is gluten and what's the problem with wheat? Well, really the problem with gluten is that it's half made of this other molecule called gliadin. And gliadin is very difficult to digest and break down. And it's found in wheat, rye, and barley. Not exactly, but that's close enough. And there's lots of gluten-free grains. And then there's lots of grains that have gluten. So people say, well, I'm gluten-free. I'm eating durum wheat. I'm eating durum or semolina. No, those are both wheat. They're still wheat. Or I'm eating udon noodles because they're made mostly with buckwheat. And it's like, yeah, but if you look at the package, it still usually has some wheat in it. So what is this gliadin protein? So wheat by nature is about 6% protein, and 90% of that is from gluten, and half of that is glutenin and half is gliadin. And it's the gliadin molecule that is this 33 molecule chain that it's really hard for us to break down. And this can damage the intestines in people who have celiac disease. And they also start developing antibodies that are called tissue transglutaminase antibodies. And interestingly enough, in food manufacturing, sometimes food manufacturers add this enzyme to food. So could that be another reason we're seeing more problems with celiac disease? Because we're actually giving this inflammatory enzyme to people in processed foods. This comes from a consensus statement. There hasn't been another one since 2004. But what it says is interesting to me. It says celiac disease may be associated with an autoimmune endocrine disorder, such as thyroiditis. So when somebody has autoimmune thyroid disease, it's really important that they get checked for celiac. Or any, I would say if you have any autoimmune disease, just get checked for celiac. The risk is low, but you may as well get checked. And then a variety of neuropsychiatric conditions such as depression and anxiety, peripheral neuropathy, which we see in diabetes so much, ataxia, which is loss of balance, epilepsy, and migraines. Okay, and so you start thinking about that and it's like, well, how many people do you know who are depressed or anxious? How many people you know who have psychiatric issues? How many people do you know who have neurological issues? And what I would say is, gluten's the first thing I think of. Well, let's get rid of it and see how you feel. And what's amazing is that usually if gluten is an issue for somebody, within 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks, they're starting to feel like, oh my gosh, my life is changing. I've never felt this good. And are they better? No, not yet, but they're on their way to better. You know, they can be 50% better in 2 weeks, which is amazing. So celiac disease, what we used to think about it was that people with celiac disease, how they presented was that they were super skinny, they couldn't gain weight, they had diarrhea, and they were malnourished, and sometimes they had anemia. And that was thought to be, well, this is celiac disease. And now we know that only about 15% of people with celiac disease present that way. Other people present with Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or depression. Alice Bast, who is the founder of the Foundation for Celiac Awareness. She had been to dozens of doctors. She had many repeated miscarriages. She had a stillborn baby. And she finally went to her doctor and said, somebody told me that there's a problem you can have from wheat. Could you test me for it? And her doctor said, I'll test you, but you don't have it. Well, lo and behold, she has it. And she also, what she amazes me is I actually interviewed her once about maybe 15 years ago, but she's so interesting because her story is amazing because she's like, well, people should know about this. I'm going to write an NIH grant and I'm going to get funding to do something about this. So she took a grant writing class and she wrote a grant to the NIH and she got it. You know, it's like, okay, it's good to be really ignorant because if she had known, like I would never write one, you know. Anyway, it can show up as skin stuff, it can show up as arthritis, it can show up as epilepsy or neurological issues or mental health issues. It looks just like IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome. So a lot of time people think they get diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome because they've got gas and bloating and diarrhea and constipation, and their doctor just goes, well, you've got irritable bowel syndrome. You know, one of the things that makes like integrative clinicians better, I think, is that we're just more curious. In a way, you know, we're willing to kind of look outside of the edges and look. When I teach at the Institute for Functional Medicine, all the doctors and nurses and chiropractors and like everybody who comes, they're there because they're feeling like, you know, I'm working with something, but it doesn't feel right. I have a dietitian who's a very prominent RD who's in my doctoral program right now. And the other day she sent me this email. She goes, you know, I always felt like there was something missing about the way that I'm working. And now I see what it is because there's a whole new lens, you know? And I think it's always good to look this way, and then it's always really good to look this way and this way and this way, you know? Like as many viewpoints as we can hold because you never know what tools you're gonna need. So this comes from beyondceliac.org. So currently 83% of people who have celiac disease have not been diagnosed with it. Okay, and it takes on average somewhere between 6 to 9 years for the average person to be diagnosed with it. I remember reading a book called How Doctors Think by, I forget, there's 2 books by the same name, but this was written by the man and a physician. I think his name might be Knoop. I can't remember. Anyway, and the first story that he tells is about this woman who'd been diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. And she'd been to all these doctors and she kept saying, I don't have an eating disorder. I just feel terrible when I eat. And her boyfriend finally said, look, I want you to see this doctor. And she's like, okay. And if I go see this doctor, then you'll leave me alone, right? Because, and the doctor took one look, he heard her story and he said, you have celiac disease. You know, so it takes, you know, we only know what we know. So if you go to somebody who doesn't know, then they can't diagnose it. It's the same thing I tell my students. I say, we are not physicians. We don't know how to diagnose diseases. We're not trained in doing that. You know, go see a doctor who knows that. You might recognize it and you might send them back to their doctor and say, you know, ask your doctor to test you for celiac. But, you know, we don't know. Could that woman have been super skinny because she had some horrible cancer? Yeah. You know, so anyway. So I thought I'd put in some pictures. This beautiful thing is the inside of your intestines. And it has these beautiful loops. It's kind of how I feel like my cheek feels, you know? Anyway, it's soft, and this absorptive surface, these are called villi, and they're brand new every 3 to 5 days, and we keep making them. And this is the absorptive lining where we absorb all of our food. And what's so cool about it is if you laid it out flat, it would be bigger than this room. It's about the size of a doubles tennis court. Isn't that about the size of this room? Okay. And what happens in people with celiac disease is that they get mowed down. Okay, so instead of being this beautiful thing, they're all flattened out. And so there's no absorption, which is why people end up malnourished, because there's no tennis court for them to take in all these nutrients. And on the edges of all those little sweet bumps are these fringes, and these are called the microvilli, or the brush border. And you can see why they call it a brush border. Anybody here lactose intolerant? I am. Anyway, so, because every time I eat dairy products, I end up with, and my nose gets stuffed up. So it's like, if that's what I notice, then I don't notice what's going on inside, but there's probably some bad things going on. So anyway, so these brush borders, on the tippy tops of these are where we have enzymes that help us break down lactose and sugar and fruit sugars. And when they're gone, we can't absorb those. We can't absorb those foods. So these microvilli, see how long they are on the left side? That's in a healthy person, and the person with celiac, remember I said they were mowed down. Well, if a person who has celiac stops eating gluten for 6 to 9 months, they can look like that again. That's kind of cool. I think it's cool. Okay, so the clinical features are, they're usually GI symptoms, malnutrition. In kids, you see that they're not growing right, or that their puberty is not happening. And they can have all these things that I mentioned before, and associated diseases, type 1 diabetes, thyroid, autoimmune thyroid disease, Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, IgA deficiency, and IgA kidney disease. So, you know, and any other autoimmune disease. So let's look at neurological issues. So this is 72 people with celiac disease, and 28% of them have migraines, 20% have carpal tunnel syndrome, 35% say, oh, I'm depressed, I have personality changes, or even that they have schizophrenia. There's been a lot of research since the 1950s on the coincidence of schizophrenia and gluten and dairy. And this I found really interesting. They took 29 teenagers who had celiac disease and 29 kids who didn't, and they found major depression in almost a third of the kids with celiac disease, and only 7%, I say, in teenagers. Oh my gosh. Like, we should not be comfortable with even 7% of our kids having major depression. But also huge amounts of disruptive behavior, and this depression and the disruptive behavior. So if you got a kid who's really disrupted, get them checked for celiac disease, or a grandchild or whatever, because the other behavior issues happen way before the diagnosis of celiac. So the prevalence of celiac disease. So you can see it's a white-skinned people disease, okay? African, Hispanic, and Asian Americans have like less than 0.5% of people get it. In the average American population, it's about 1%. And then if you've got a sibling or a parent with celiac disease, your risk is about 4.5%. It's not all, right? And then if you've got an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, then your risk is about 2.5%. So what's fascinating to me about this is a genetic disease, right? It's a genetic disease. And what Dr. Alessio Fasano says is, yeah, it's a genetic disease, but that's only one piece of it. You have to have the right genes, you have to have gluten, and you have to have a leaky gut. You got all three of those things, or add some other trauma onto that, boom, then you've got the right conditions to make that happen. Okay? So it doesn't happen in everyone. And what we've got is different types. So we've got people who have what's called symptomatic celiac disease. They know they have it, or they're still undiagnosed, but they have it. Then we have people who get tested for it, and they test positive. And so their tissue transglutaminase enzymes are positive, but they don't have any signs or symptoms of celiac disease. Should they actually stop eating gluten? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then we have people who have latent celiac disease. They have the right genetics for it, but they don't have it. Because I said, only, even if you have a brother or sister or parent with it, it's less than 5% of a chance that you're going to get it, right? So it can look like this, like dermatitis herpetiformis. And then there are some people who get celiac disease and they go off gluten and they're really good at it. They avoid all gluten from all foods and they're still having issues. So a long time ago, I worked with this dietitian who actually specializes in celiac disease because she has celiac disease. And she'd been gluten-free for 12 years. In the meantime, she developed lupus. She had sleep issues. She had other issues. She was tired all the time. And I said, let's just do a full elimination diet. Let's have you only eat non-gluten containing grains, fresh fruits and vegetables, chicken and fish and lamb and goat and, and then let's have you eat, some good quality oils, and let's just do that, and herbs and spices and things, and let's just do that for a few weeks. Within a couple weeks, her whole being had shifted. Was she 100% better? No, but we had time, she was way better. And over the period of months, and so then it changed the way that she worked with her own clients, her own patients. So they just don't feel better. So sometimes you have to do more. So why? Well, maybe they got inadvertent gluten exposure. So I know we don't really lick envelopes anymore, but envelope glue has gluten in it. Stamp glue has gluten in it. Remember how we used to make paste as kids? White flour and water, right? So they might show up as not being able to eat fruit, or they might, still have like irritable bowel syndrome. Some of them get, it's called lymphocytic colitis. It's in the inflammatory bowel disease, but kind of a baby version of it. They might also have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or they probably have pancreatic insufficiency. So like if somebody's been gluten-free, but they still don't feel well, then you always have to look deeper. And then this is on corn. There's some people who also can't eat corn. There's some people who can't eat any grains. There's literature that demonstrates that some people who have celiac disease, when they have quinoa, which we think, well, it's a seed, it's not even related at all, but some people who have celiac can't even have quinoa or millet. And so you start looking at that, and so it's always, if somebody walks into my office, which I'm teaching now, I'm not in practice, but I'm always looking for what's right for this person sitting in front of me, not some mythological person. So I said before, now we've got irritable bowel syndrome, and we've got that in celiac disease, and then we've got celiac disease, and then in the middle we've got gluten sensitivity that looks just like irritable bowel syndrome and looks a lot like celiac. But people test negative. So what I wanted to do was escape from here, and I wanted to show you a short video because this is one of my idols. And so I thought I would just kind of play this for everybody. This is, uh-oh, can they hear this? No. I'm just going to stop for a second. So This is Dr. Alessio Fasano. His group discovered this molecule called zonulin. And the gut barrier, which I talked about probably last year, it's selectively permeable. It allows some things to come through, like digested food and nutrients. And then it's not supposed to let chemicals and microbes and fungi, it's not supposed to let a lot of other things in. And it's also not supposed to let undigested food in, which we've got food molecules that are not fully digested. They go into the bloodstream and the immune system starts reacting to them. And so there are actually gates that open in between those microvilli in the intestines, and they're gates that open to let food through. And these get opened wide in people who have celiac disease, who eat gluten, and they also get opened wide for people who have bacterial infections of low grade. Like most irritable bowel syndrome is actually a low grade bacterial infection that can be treated by diet and herbs or antibiotics. And when people have this kind of low grade infection, it also opens these gates, and we get a lot of garbage in our bloodstream. And that molecule, there's probably about 40 molecules, but this main one that Dr. Fasano and his group discovered is called zonulin. And so that's what he's going to talk about. And I'm a total groupie.
Only 3% of the human genome, 1,500 genes are sitting there, but it's packed with genes that are involved in many chronic inflammatory diseases, mainly autoimmune diseases, cancer, disease in the nervous system. So, for example, genes for lupus, IBD, type 1 diabetes, RA is sitting there, like the breast cancer, some of the lymphoma, the prostate cancer genes are sitting there. And
diabetes.
Finally, Lou Gehrig's disease, lipodystrophy, MS, and all these genes are sitting on chromosome 16. Once this gene, for example, was cloned and it was located on that chromosome, a lot of researchers worldwide started to look at in which conditions these molecules involved, and the CD3 category chronic inflammatory disease popped up. So this is something this is a slide in 2011, and you see that there are some autoimmune diseases like celiac disease, IBD, RA, lupus, type 1, and then brain cancer like gliomas, breast cancer, lung cancer, ovarian cancer, and so on and so forth, and then MS, schizophrenia, and now autism. Now, in only 5 years, the list has been populated by a bunch of other conditions. Again, these are products of science that came only out in the past 4 or 5 years. So you see, for example, that irritable bowel syndrome is involved, HIV, MS,
type 1 and 2 diabetes.
Very severe chronic inflammatory condition of neonates. Non-alcoholic fatty disease and metabolic disorder that leads to type 2 diabetes involved there, gluten sensitivity, sepsis, and so on and so forth. So in other words, this now is becoming common denominator of a series of chronic inflammatory diseases in which, again, the third piece of the puzzle, genes, environment, and now the bridge of the barrier seems to be common denominators.
Okay. Genes, the environment, and the compromise of the gut barrier. And I talked about that last year, so you could listen to that video. Anyway, so zonulin, leaky barrier function, is one of these things that it's a common denominator for so many diseases that we have. And last year I talked about its role in cardiometabolic disease, heart disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, high lipids. So we did like a whole 90 minutes on that. And then what this basically says is, the genes are shared, the types of genes, and that's what he was saying. It's all on the same gene that all these things are coded for. And so there's something wrong. And this is a flow chart to just kind of show you again what I was explaining before. So at the top, we got gluten-related disorders. And here we've got autoimmune, so celiac disease, dermatitis herpetiformis, which almost all the time is related to celiac disease, but there are some other conditions, like somebody might not yet have celiac disease, but they might have dermatitis herpetiformis, and they might have Sjogren's syndrome or rheumatoid arthritis or some other autoimmune disease. And then gluten ataxia, which is this loss of balance. And then these, remember I was saying it could be silent, it could be active, or it could be latent, it could be potential. And then on this side, we've got those wheat allergies. And you've got, they could turn out to be asthma or food allergy or I forget what wheatia stands for, but it's that the lectins that are actually in wheat. And it could be hives. And then there's gluten sensitivity. So we've got all these different kind of categories, but the mechanisms are different. It's like gluten sensitivity, at least at this moment in time, it's not thought to be an immune response, or autoimmune, I should say. It's immune, but not autoimmune. So again, I kind of put them all together so you could see the differences between them. So we've talked a lot about celiac disease, and in gluten sensitivity, about half of the people who have gluten sensitivity also have the right genetics for celiac, but they don't develop celiac. They develop gluten sensitivity. They don't have problems with malabsorption. They might have irritable bowel syndrome. They might have depression or anxiety or foggy thinking, and headaches, fatigue, joint issues. You know, like if you've never tried going gluten-free for 2 weeks, I would just say do it 100% and just see what happens. And if you live with other people, have everybody in the household do it for 2 weeks. Just see what happens. And then wheat allergy, it's really an allergy. It's itchy, rashy, you know, you can't breathe. It's just kind of all that stuff. And then celiac disease, again, you know, we've talked about, well, we didn't talk about bone and joint, but osteoporosis is associated because it's kind of an autoimmune breakdown. Tingling and numbness, muscle cramps, missed periods for women, infertility, recurrent miscarriages, thyroiditis, tooth discoloration. I had one client that the only sign that she had celiac disease was that the enamel on her teeth was disappearing. So I'm like, I wonder what that's about. So I did some research, and there it was, right in the literature. Seizures, dementia, hepatitis, but gluten sensitivity, again, it could have joint and bone pain and bone loss and leg numbness and muscle cramps and unexplained anemia and a really shiny bright red tongue. So, you know, there's a lot of overlap, which is why these things don't get diagnosed. So how do you actually test for this? So again, I'm going to just kind of go through this because we've already done this. And I just put this slide in here to show you that this is a lectin, this wheat germ agglutinin. I'm staying with a friend, and her mom had yogurt and fruit yesterday for breakfast, and she dumped a whole bunch of wheat germ in it. I'm like, well, I used to think that was totally normal, you know? And now it's like, well, some people can't break that down. And we don't have a lot of research on it. But this is really fascinating to me. We have some people react to gluten, and some people react to dairy products with almost like schizophrenia. And we see this in the autism community a lot, that about 45% of the kids in the autism community react to gluten as if it's an opioid. Now, I have never smoked opium, but I used to watch those movies after school, those very culturally not acceptable movies anymore, where people would be in China and they'd be smoking opium, men, would be smoking opium and they'd just be glazed over. And I'm like, well, isn't that how autistic kids a lot are? They're withdrawn and they don't talk and they're glazed over sometimes, and it's like you take them off gluten, which is the only thing they want to eat, and some of them wake up. Not all of them. If you look at the diet of most kids, but especially autistic kids, it's all dairy and wheat. And why? Because they're addicted to it. It's a drug and they just want more of it. Grilled cheese sandwich, macaroni and cheese, pizza, cereal. It's what they love to eat. And they won't eat anything else because they got to get their fix. And a really interesting study that was done, and I didn't bring it, it was done by Dohan in, I think, the 1950s or early 1960s. He had men who were hospitalized for schizophrenia in an inpatient institution. And he took them off of gluten and dairy, and 60% of them had a positive response in GI symptoms and mental health and their schizophrenia. Wow, that's a pretty cheap intervention. So there's genetic testing for celiac disease. Have any of you done any of your genetic testing? Genomic testing? Okay. So anyway, don't do it unless you have a family member who has celiac disease, okay? Because about 35 to 40% of us have this gene, have these genes. And we're not going to develop celiac unless all those other things happen, okay? So the only reason to really do this test is you've been gluten-free for a year. Your doctor says, I want to see if you have celiac disease, so you got to start eating gluten. And you go, I'm not eating gluten. I feel really great, and I'm not going to do that to myself. So the doctor says, okay, well, let's at least test your genes, because over 99% of people with celiac disease have these genes. Okay, so if you don't have the gene, then we know it's not celiac disease, and it's gluten sensitivity, which may not be a lifelong issue. It's not as serious as celiac disease. So that would be the only reason. Or let's say that you have a brother or sister with celiac disease, or a parent or a child. You might want to just do this as a simple thing. But what's typically done to test for celiac disease is they do something called total IgA antibodies. And these antibodies are, they look to see total because these comprise 80% of the antibodies in your gut and on your skin. So they want to make sure you got plenty of them, because otherwise the other tests don't make any sense. Because if the other tests are normal, but this is really low, well, they're both really low. Because it's really low, it doesn't tell you anything. So they measure that tissue transglutaminase enzyme. And sometimes they'll also do something called endomycel antibodies. And together, these three tests can really determine whether you have celiac or not. It used to always be that gastroenterologists wanted to do biopsies through endoscopy, through scoping. And now a lot of them are just going, we can do these blood tests and we can know. They might still want to do scoping to see how much damage there is, but not all of them are doing that anymore. There's the genetic, and then there's something called deaminated gliadin, which is like how well we break down the gliadin molecule. So these are all tests for celiac disease. And also, if you've got somebody who has celiac disease, we usually retest them like once a year, because if these levels start going back up, then you know that they're cheating a little bit, or they're getting some inadvertent gluten, which you don't want them to have. For non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat allergy, they could do skin or blood testing for wheat allergy. For non-celiac gluten sensitivity, they can do food sensitivity testing to gluten and gliadin. But what's interesting is about half of the people who feel better not eating gluten, they have normal test results, completely normal. And then I wanted to show you, but I think I probably won't. We have a couple of really interesting new tests. If we have time later, I'll show you, or if you ask me it as a question. But there's a company called Vibrant America that has a very great celiac panel, but also really looks for gluten intolerance in a much more sophisticated way. And then we also have Cyrex Labs, who also has a much more innovative way of looking for gluten sensitivity. And what I think is so fascinating is, like, when I first heard about tissue transglutaminase for celiac testing or deaminated gliadin, these were radical concepts 10 years ago, and now they're just mainstream medicine. So I think that what Wheat-Zoomer and Cyrex are doing, I think in another 5 years, everybody will be doing much more sophisticated testing, but right now it's not happening. And then also there's a company called Cell Science, and they also have a more sophisticated test. The best test, stop eating gluten for 2 weeks and see if you feel different. So that's just kind of what the Wheat-Zoomer looks like. And so they have the total IgA, the tissue transglutaminase, IgG and IgA. They have the deaminated gliadin, IgG, IgA. These are the types of antibodies. They test zonulin. Cyrex tests zonulin antibodies. These are anti-zonulin, and so they test total zonulin, which is that molecule that Dr. Fasano was talking about. And then they also test for zonulin antibodies, anti-actin. They test for LPS, that's lipopolysaccharide. It's like, do you have these bacteria that are opening your leaky gut? And then they test for that wheat germ agglutinin in 2 ways. So this is kind of one of those more sophisticated tests. And if you've got gluten sensitivity, you're going to see it there. So how does this relate to diabetes? Type 1. So I don't think I have to really go through these that much, but in 1985, 30 million people around the world had diabetes, and today 1 billion people have diabetes. One of my mentors, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, went to China 25 years ago, and he gave this brilliant talk about type 2 diabetes. And the person who invited him to this university came back and said, well, that was very interesting, but to us, it's completely theoretical. We don't see type 2 diabetes in our culture, period. That's 25 years ago. In China, they invited him back a couple years ago because type 2 diabetes is rampant. You know, when we see all of our foods getting, all of our attractive, cheap, easy foods. I once saw this infomercial of a TV show about the CEO of Pepsi talking about their expansion into Asia and how exciting it was. And I'm just going, oh, don't do that. No. Do you have any ethics? No. Anyway, and there's a lot of diabetes. You know, this is in adults. So you just see, look at this part of the country. And, you know, this is another one. You have all these slides. So this is by kind of in children and adults by ethnicity. And then I just put in a couple of these because the average person is exposed to 100, average man, 80 chemicals a day, average woman, 160 chemicals a day, because most of the men are probably not using as many care products as we are on their skin and hair and nails and you know what else. Anyway, so this is just an association. This is not a causation, but we have, for type 2 diabetes, we have such strong evidence that chemicals like bisphenol A can trigger type 2 diabetes. So, you know, when you talk about that leaky gut and the zonulin, it's like the chemicals are one of those things that can open this up and make you more susceptible. So this is a slide, and again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but the microbiome, I'm a microbiome geek. I love it, okay? So, but what we know about the microbiome is the microbiome really drives autoimmune disease, whether you're fat or thin, happy or depressed, a lot of different things. And so many things we can't kind of go back and redo. None of us can go ahead and breastfeed right now. We can't change the way we were born by C-section or vaginally. We can't change that we've taken antibiotics during our lives, but all these things lead to more gut permeability, and these can lead to type 2 diabetes because you get more leaky gut and a disordered microbiome, which we call dysbiosis. And we also see that there's a lot more increased intestinal permeability, leaky gut, altered gut barrier function in people who have type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes. So, so it starts in the gut. You know, we always thought that diabetes started with the liver. Well, the liver is part of the digestive system, but really what's driving the inflammation of the liver so that the islets of, you know, the pancreas stops producing beta cells to produce insulin is that there's inflammation in the gut that the liver gets affected by. And so, and leaky gut and leaky, all this stuff starts this cascade. So celiac, so what's the relationships of celiac disease to type 2 diabetes? Well, celiac disease, remember where I said 1% of the population gets it? Well, in people with type 2 diabetes, 4 to 6% get it. So it's not everybody, but it's worth being tested for because you might be in that 1 to 6%. And then celiac disease screening is recommended upon diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. This is just all endocrinologists are doing this. If somebody has any GI symptoms at all, poor weight loss, they can't control their glucose levels, yet 40 to 60% may have no symptoms at all. So my recommendation, if I were working with a physician, would be just test everybody. Most people are going to be fine, but it's not expensive and insurance will pay for it, and you may as well just be sure. And most of them are diagnosed within the first 2 years, but a lot of them go a long time without knowing that they also have celiac disease. So they're getting sicker and they don't know it. And I just kind of made this, I just started looking at all the research about like what's similar between these two things. And breastfeeding reduces incidence. They all have pancreatic insufficiencies, increased zonulin, increased intestinal permeability. They're related to autoimmune diseases. They have similar but not identical genetics. As Dr. Fasano was saying, they're on the same gene, but they're not exactly the same genes. Both begin in the gut but have systemic effects. They have infectious and chemical triggers and stress triggers. So if you're living with people who make you feel miserable, stop living with them. Or if you're doing a job that you don't like, stop doing it. You know, life is too short. And then modern living increases the incidence. So, you know, these are all driving factors in both diseases. And I just put in this to let you know that there's this huge study going on right now in Europe and in the United States with almost 425,000 babies who are at high risk of developing type 1 diabetes, and because they have family members with it. And so far, they've measured them till the average is 6 years old. They're going to do this till they're 15. And what they've found so far is not tons, but they've got 2% of the kids have developed type 1 diabetes already. Almost 8% have developed some other autoimmune disease. In celiac, 5.5% have been diagnosed with celiac already. And then elevated tissue transglutaminase in 15%. So it's like, well, maybe they have kind of silent celiac, but they've got it. So the incidence is much higher than what we were told, like this 4 to 6%. And they're only 6 years old. So it'll be interesting over the next 9 years to see what the data shows. And then almost a little over 1% have both type 1 diabetes and celiac disease. So it's not just that people are imagining that they might be related to each other. No, they are. Okay? And then in type 2 diabetes, what they say is the gut microbiome is now recognized as the key driver of individual variation in the likelihood of developing obesity and diabetes. I wish I could say I just make this stuff up, but I don't. I find it in the literature. And again, for type 2 diabetes, you know, it's like how you were born, we can't change. Lots of medications can change your blood sugar responses, so you might want to go over those with a pharmacist. Your genetics, which we talked about. Exercise, it's just not optional. It's good for us in every possible way. And so, you know, minimum is 150 minutes a week, period. That's just like minimum amount of exercise. Smoking, alcohol. We know there's leaky gut in type 2 diabetes. And then this, again, this is a chart that I showed last year about the relationship between the gut microbiome and leaky gut and developing type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and inflammatory bowel disease. It all starts from having inflammation that comes from the way we live. So eating real foods, eating tons of vegetables. And again, you have all these slides, and I think you have them both. I sent them to her in 6 slides a page and also full. So if you want those, you can ask, and they can email them to you if you don't have them. So should you screen for celiac disease in people who have type 2 diabetes who are poorly controlled? And it said, you know, yeah, if they're poorly controlled, go ahead and test for it. But don't just screen everybody who has type 2 diabetes. That's pretty much. Because there were only a little over a normal amount, you know, like 1% is normal. This was 1.5%. And then this was interesting. Should people who have type 2 diabetes, what's the relationship with gluten? So this was from the Nurses' Health Study, which we have research on pretty much 1 million things from these nurses, because there were so many of them. And they filled out food frequency questionnaires, and they had a certain amount of gluten every day. And they said, you know, we found an inverse association between gluten intake and type 2 diabetes. So it was actually the more grains you ate, the higher, anyway. But they say it suggests that gluten intake in the general population is unlikely to contribute to an elevated type 2 diabetes amounts. So again, it's like, well, I don't know, but this is the research we have at this moment. So what are the takeaways? So in people with celiac disease, they can have problems with digestion on any of these levels. So we know that they can have malabsorption, people in both celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, less than gluten sensitivity. They all have increased intestinal permeability, which is leaky gut. It starts in the microbiome, and they all have inflammation, and many of them have an immune response. And then it can affect you in your enteric nervous system, which is the gut brain. So working with a good nutritionist or a good integrative physician or clinician of any sort can really help people kind of come up with this. And then I also gave you this handout, and you should have this in your folder, about like how do you heal a leaky gut. So there's lots of different herbs and supplements that you can use. And then we have a number of studies demonstrating that taking probiotics can help regulate glucose levels. So if I were working with somebody who had either type 1 or type 2 diabetes, I would want them to take a probiotic supplement. And here's more studies that show different types of probiotics that have been shown to be beneficial in people who have diabetes. And then the 5 R's. So the 5 R's are remove, replace, reinoculate, repair, and rebalance, reconnect. So I'm just going to kind of go through those. So you want to remove foods that aren't healthful for you. I know this looks delicious, but you can't eat it, okay? And then remove chronic stress, and then look for infections. Infections drive inflammation, so look for infection, and then look for chemicals. And then Sid Baker has this tack theory, and what he says is if you're sitting on a tack and you take one away, you might not feel 50% better. And that tack is like if you have a headache and you take an aspirin or you put lavender oil on your, it might or might not make your headaches all the way better, because if your headaches are from like having glasses that aren't the right prescription, well, you can put, this on your brows and take aspirin all day long, and it's not going to fix the problem. So he also says if you're sitting on two tacks and you take one away, you might not feel 50% better. So if you're gluten sensitive and you take that away, but you don't take away other inflammatory foods, you might not feel better, which is why I kind of do bigger diets. And the third one that he didn't write, somebody said, if you're sitting on a tack and you take it away and somebody keeps putting tacks on your chair, you're not going to feel better. And that's like, if we keep doing the things that make us sick, we're not going to get better. And it's really hard to make changes, but if we want to feel differently, we got to do things differently. Pat was just telling me about her new routine where she's doing intermittent fasting, and she feels different from doing it, and she feels like it's good for her, so if we want to feel different, we got to make changes. We want to re-inoculate, and we want to feed the microbiome. So we want to eat prebiotic-rich foods, which are nuts and seeds and beans and fruits and vegetables. We want to, and whole grains, but not gluten-containing ones. We want to take probiotics or eat probiotic-rich foods. So we want to eat kimchi or sauerkraut or homemade pickles or kefir or yogurt or whatever it is that you really like. Or hard cheeses, they're loaded with microbes, So eat cultured and fermented foods, take probiotics because they help, and then you want to repair, and that's all the things that are on that leaky gut list. You want to fix fix that gut barrier, and then you want to rebalance. I know when people get diagnosed with celiac disease or type 1 or type 2 diabetes, it's like they feel like their world is ended. But life goes on, and pretty soon there's a new normal. And that new normal includes all kinds of habits that might make you feel better in a whole lot of other ways. So sometimes what feels like the worst is not the worst. Sometimes the worst can be the best because it changes our total health trajectory to be the best. So you want to come back into a new balance if you get one of these diagnoses. And you also all of us need to get enough sleep. The average American gets 1 hour less sleep a night than they need. So try to get more sleep. Figure out what makes you feel happy. Start a hobby, rest, relax. With people who I work with who have just kind of mystery illnesses, autoimmune disease, whatever, I go, I want you, like the woman with celiac who'd been gluten-free for 12 years, I said, I want you to rest 2 hours every day during daylight. I need you to tell your body that you live in a safe world and you can stop. And she goes, as all my clients used to when I would tell them this, and as you might be saying, that sounds so good. It's not possible, right? But what she did was she said, can I lie down for 5 minutes on the floor of my office between patients? I said, sure, that works for me. She goes, oh, and she did it. It was amazing. Anyway, what's your sense of purpose or connection? What's your community? How do you connect with spirit? How do you connect with something greater? Breathing, we can all do that. So those are the 5 R's, and we want to restore with food, and in this particular population, a gluten-free diet, gluten-free, dairy-free diet, I would start with, and I'd also look at, a full elimination diet. Common sources of gluten are here. Medications, so prescription meds, if they're a brand name, they have to list if they have gluten on them. But if they're generic, they don't have to list it. And I take a couple generic meds and they get changed all the time. They get changed all the time, like who's the cheapest one. So, so the pharmacist has to be really aware if you have celiac because they're in there. And this was interesting. So there were a bunch of people who thought they were gluten sensitive, but they didn't get better on a gluten-free diet. So they went on to the FODMAP diet, which is a low prebiotic, low probiotic diet that's used for irritable bowel syndrome, and the people improved. So was it really gluten, or was it really that they have a low-grade infection going on in their gut, and when they calmed down the inflammation, everything got better? And that's kind of what looks like a FODMAP diet. And then if you have celiac disease, these are like musts. I always have people carry gluten splitting enzymes with them in their pocket or their purse or wherever if they're out of their home. And the reason is if they're eating out, they might get inadvertent gluten exposure. And so will these actually really, like can somebody with celiac disease just take these enzymes and just eat gluten? No. But if they get a little bit, it protects them, okay? And if you're going to eat out, you have to call ahead to a restaurant and say, do you have a separate place where you prepare gluten-free food? Do you use separate cutting boards? Do you have, it sounds insane, but you have to do it. And even in your own home, if you have people who are eating gluten, you have to have separate toaster ovens. You really have to go great lengths. So if somebody's got celiac disease in a family, it's better just not to have celiac in the house. Gluten in the house. But, if some people aren't willing to do that in a family, then you have to have separate toasters or toaster ovens because of all those crumbs that are in there. And you have to have separate cutting boards, and you have to have separate sponges that you use to wipe down counters. And, it's crazy, but you have to do it. And if you're going to somebody's home for dinner, you have to say, I cannot have any gluten-containing grains. So what are you planning on having? Because the person might say, remember in my big fat Greek wedding when they said, I'm a vegetarian? She goes, oh, well, we're having lamb. So people don't know what gluten is. So they say, oh, well, I won't make any bread, but we'll have pasta. Or, oh, we're having ravioli. That's not bread. So, so if you're going to somebody's house, you have to be really clear, and you have to say, what are we having? Because if we're not having what I can eat, then I'll bring something for myself. Or if you're going to a restaurant, you might have to bring something for yourself if you're not convinced that that restaurant is clean. And I know this sounds extreme, but I had a friend who had celiac disease, and she went to a restaurant and they had gluten-free pasta. She goes, I haven't had pasta in so long. That sounds really delicious. And she took one bite of it, and the waiter came back and he said, stop. It does have a little bit of gluten in it. Okay? She had a reaction that lasted like 3 weeks from one bite. So I know I'm sounding like a crazy person, like separate toasters and cutting boards and knives and like all this, but it's if somebody really has celiac disease, it has to be 100%. And the family has to get behind that. So if you're eating out, it makes it really hard, but you got to be I was a vegetarian for a really long time, so I got really used to going out to eat at people's homes and saying, by the way, I'm a vegetarian, should I bring a main dish for me to eat? So I got used to doing that. I know how it feels. It feels weird, but it's good. And most people, they're really, if somebody's inviting you to their home for dinner, they want you to eat something, they want to make something that you're going to eat, because they're really insulted if you don't. So Anyway, and find gluten-free alternatives that work for you. Most of them are garbage, you know. Like I pretty much don't eat gluten, and I just kind of avoid the whole thing. You know, I don't eat gluten-free breads. They don't really taste very good. So I have more sweet potatoes. I have more yams, you know. So anyway, we're just about done, I promise.
Oh, okay.
I'm almost done. And then I'll take a few questions. I didn't get to start till almost quarter after, so I'm taking my time. So anyway, if you really need to be gluten-free, look for these logos on foods, and eat more fruits and vegetables, anti-inflammatory foods. Here's some resources for you. If you think you have celiac, you can learn a lot more about it. Here's some gluten-free cookbooks. Here's some books on gluten and what it does to you. And there's me and my books, and that's a wrap. See, I told you I was done.
Thanks so much, Liz.